Hello, my name is Jose Figueroa with an approved workman, where we are rightly dividing the word of truth. Welcome to another week of Bible study. I am glad that you're here as we open up God's Word one more time. Our current series is Preserving the Covenant Community, a study of the book of Esther. If you're new to this Bible teaching ministry, here is how you can learn more about our work. First, visit our website, www.anapprovedworkman.org. That's anapprovedworkman.org. On the website, you can learn more about the mission and vision for this ministry, our approach to Bible study, and also review our statement of faith. On the website, you can also listen directly to any episodes from our current series or any episodes from previous series we have done on the podcast. You can subscribe directly to the podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Amazon Music, as well as other podcast directories. If you want to connect with us on social media, my Instagram channel is @anapprovedworkman. We also have a page on Pinterest, a Pinterest profile @anapprovedworkman, and our Facebook page is an approved workman 215. Finally, you can also subscribe to our video channels on either YouTube or Rumble, and you can catch the video version of each episode of the podcast. Today, we're lesson number 1 in the series Preserving the Covenant Community from the book of Esther. This is volume number 3 of the series After the Exile, our study of Ezra-Nehemiah-Esther. The lesson is titled, The Queen is Gone, Long Live the Queen, Part 1. Our focus passage is Esther chapter 1. In the opening verses of the book of Esther, we see Queen Vashti of Middle Persia being deposed and the rise of Queen Esther. Have you ever won a contest? Have you ever won a contest on TV? I did. As a senior in high school, my class was invited to participate in a TV show called Adelante Juventud, or Youth Forward, in Puerto Rico back in 1985. The setting was very simple. High schools will be invited to participate in a series of events against each other, built around education, and the prize was $1,000. My graduating class was small, around 60 students, and we could really use that additional money for the activities we had planned for the year. Within the contest, there were several events that allowed each school to accumulate points throughout the program. My role was in the juniors section, where we had 4 rounds of questions on various topics. The winner of that event would get a chance to spin a wheel for additional points. As it happened, I won my event, but we were behind by quite a bit at that point. I needed a huge score. But the wheel was a game of total chance. I had to press a button just at the right time to maximize our score. And that's all I could do, guess at when to press the button. I pressed the button and I got the right score. We won! Now, did I do that? My classmates hailed me as a hero, but our class president said that in reality, God caused that to happen. I was in the right position and at the right time, but the outcome was not mine to control. Our win, as you would say, was providential. In our previous episode, we covered our introduction to the study of Esther. Here are a few points on the book's scriptural and historical setting that we cover in that lesson. God told his people that if they chose to break their covenant with him, he would again allow other nations to take them into slavery. Jeremiah 2:14 and 15. True to his promises, God used the Assyrians and the Babylonians to carry out his chastisement upon wayward Israel and Judah. Because Judah persisted in her unfaithfulness to the covenant, God chasing his people with 70 years of captivity, from which they returned to Jerusalem as reported by Ezra and Nehemiah. Cyrus of Medo Persia overthrew Babylon in October 539 BC, and in accord with his policy of encouraging subject people to return to their homelands, he issued a decree in 538 BC allowing the Jews to do the same. About 50,000 did return under the leadership of Zerubbabel, and the foundation of the temple was laid, though it was not completed until 515 during the reign of Darius I. As there had been three waves of deportation from Israel into Babylon, 605, 597, and 586 BC, so there were actually three returns to Jerusalem over a 9-decade span. Complete, uncontested political autonomy, however, never returned. The events of the Book of Esther take place during the reign of the Persian king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, who reigned from 486 through 465 BC. Esther was an orphan from the tribe of Benjamin who lived with the Jewish exiles in Persia. She was reared by her cousin Mordecai, a minor government official and covert leader of the Jewish community, in Susa, the capital of the Persian kingdom. Esther became queen after the king became displeased with Queen Vashti when she refused to obey his command to attend a festival. If you missed the previous episode, I encourage you to listen to the podcast or watch the video version of that lesson on either YouTube or Rumble. In today's lesson, we begin in earnest our study of the Book of Esther. In her commentary on the Book of Esther, Dr. Joyce Baldwin speaks on the high value the Jewish people place on the Book of Esther to this very day. She says, quote, "It is easy to see why the book is valued by Jews, who have suffered so much through the ages and have clung to the assurance implied by Purim that, however severe the threat upon the race, they have a future. God was not overt, his word not direct, and his face not revealed. Still, behind the veil of Purim, God's providence towards his people would uphold them against adversary and ideological force alike, as in Passover of old. To this day, therefore, the annual reading of the Book of Esther at Purim generates unfailing enthusiasm and keeps alive Jewish belief in God's continuing providence despite all the victimization." End quote. Dr. Mervyn Brenneman, in his commentary on Ezra-Nehemiah-Esther, gives us the historical context for the story told in Esther. He says, quote, "According to the first verse, the events of the Book of Esther took place during the reign of Xerxes, who sometimes is called Ahasuerus, king of Persia, 486 to 465 BC. That would place the events between the completion of the temple construction under Zerubbabel in 516 BC, during the reign of Darius I, and the arrival of more returnees to Jerusalem under Ezra in 458 BC, during the reign of Artaxerxes I." End quote. So that gives you an idea of what's happening in the Persian Empire this time. Remember, only 50,000 returned with Zerubbabel in that first return of exiles. A lot of the Jews stayed behind, and that included both Esther and Mordecai. Here's our lesson outline and goal for our teaching from Esther chapters 1 and 2. We're titling this lesson, "The Queen is Gone, Long Live the Queen." We have two divisions as follows: a defiant queen removed, chapter 1 verses 1 to 22, and finally a devoted queen rises, chapter 2 verses 1 to 23. Our goal for the teaching from these two chapters is this: to encourage believers to remember that God's providence works to accomplish his plans and bless his people. Again, the goal for the teaching from Esther chapters 1 and 2 is this: to encourage believers to remember that God's providence works to accomplish his plans and bless his people. Today we will focus on our first division, a defiant queen removed, chapter 1. So let's start with our first division, a defiant queen removed by reading Esther chapter 1. Now it happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Kush over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the third year of his reign, he held a banquet for all his officials and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the officials of his provinces in his presence. At that time, he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. Verse 5. When these days were finished, the king held a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the courtyard of the garden of the king's palace. There were curtains of fine white and violet linen held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings and marble columns, and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic floor of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and mineral stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful in proportion to the king's bounty. But the drinking was done according to the royal law. There was no compulsion, for so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he was to do as each person pleased. Verse 9. Queen Vashti also held a banquet for the women in the palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was cheerful with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Bista, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Sethar, and Carcas, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal turban in order to display her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's order delivered by the eunuchs. So the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. Verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king to speak this way before all who knew Persian law and justice, and were close to him, namely Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Mears, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 officials of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, since she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? And in the presence of the king and the other officials, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. Verse 17. For the queen's conduct will become known to all women, so as to make their own husbands despicable in their sight, when they say, King Ahasuerus commanded that Queen Vashti be brought into his presence, but she did not come. And this day the wives of the officials of Persia and Media who have heard about the queen's conduct will talk about it to all the king's officials, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may not come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. Verse 20. When the king's edict which he will make is heard throughout his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. Now this word pleased the king and the officials, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, that every man was to be the ruler in his own house, and the one who speaks in the language of his own people. Esther chapter 1 verses 1 through through 22. So let's get started by looking at verses 1 through 9 of chapter 1, the king's lavish celebration. In verses 1 through 4, we're told that King Ahasuerus, the ruler of the Middle Persian Empire, which covered 127 provinces from India to Kush, held a celebration in the capital city of Susa for all his officials, his attendants, his army officers, and nobles. So let's start by looking at Ahasuerus. Who is he? Dr. Joyce Baldwin tells us that, quote, Ahasuerus, in Greek Xerxes, is the Persian king mentioned in Ezra chapter 4, verse 6, who reigned 486 to 465 BC. Strangely, the Greek versions have instead the name Artaxerxes. Ahasuerus is known in the West as the king who took on the Greeks and who was twice humiliated by them in 480 and 479 BC. But he was also a great builder who completed and improved upon the great palaces which his father Darius had begun, and he consolidated the empire from India to Ethiopia. By India is meant the area drained by the Indus River, now Pakistan, not peninsular India. End quote. This magnificent and luxurious celebration was held in the third year of his reign, 483 BC, and the festivities lasted for 180 days or 6 months. In his Bible commentary, Dr. John MacArthur tells us a bit more about the context for this extravagant banquet, this celebration. He says, quote, the kingdom comprised 20 regions, which were further divided into provinces ruled over by governors. Shushan, the Hebrew rendering of the Greek Susa, the winter residence, was one of the 4 capital cities of the Persians. The other 3 included Babylon, Ecbatana, and Persepolis. 483 BC was the year that probably included the planning phase for Ahasuerus' later campaign against Greece, in which the king suffered a humiliating defeat, 481 through 479 BC. End quote. In his commentary on Ezra-Nehemiah-Esther, Dr. J. Vernon McGee speaks on the purpose of this great celebration. He says, quote, this banquet revealed the wealth, the luxury, and the regal character of this Oriental court. As I have indicated, the reason for it seems obvious. He had called in all of his princes and all of his rulers from every corner of his kingdom, that he might win their wholehearted support of the military campaign to capture Greece and to make himself the supreme ruler of the world of that day. End quote. At the end of the 6 months, the king held one last banquet, which lasted 7 days in the courtyard of the garden of the king's palace. There was grand majesty and opulence displayed, and drinks were served in golden vessels according to the king's bounty. However, no one was compelled to drink, but anyone could drink as much as they wanted. In verse 9, we're told that Queen Vashti also held a banquet at the same time for the women who were part of the royal court. So, who is Vashti? Let's learn a little more about her. She was the wife of Ahasuerus and queen in the Persian Empire between 485 and 465 BC, and a prominent character early in the story of Esther. Her refusal to respond positively to an invitation from the king threatens to demean not only the prestige of the royal throne, but also the status of husbands as heads of households throughout the kingdom. Her behavior in not appearing at the royal banquet in order to display her beauty and person is understood in the royal court as an act against the stability and order of the whole empire. And this is from an entry in the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary by John McKenna on Queen Vashti. So, again, the queen at the time, the wife of Ahasuerus, of Xerxes, she is an influential person just because of a position she holds. She is the queen. And her refusal to obey the king, as we will see, just threatens to undo the whole stability of the Persian Empire. Let's move ahead and look at verses 10 through 18, the king's order and the queen's defiance. In verses 10 and 11, we're told that on the seventh day of the banquet, King Ahasuerus was merry. I want to say drunk after so much drinking for a whole 7 days. In this state of drunkenness, the king ordered the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal turban to display her beauty before his guests. What did the king hope to accomplish is not clear to me, but it is clear that he just wanted to brag one more time before his guests. It is implied in the text that Vashti was a very beautiful woman. However, Queen Vashti refused to play and defied the king's order, which made him very angry. In his commentary on Ezra-Nehemiah-Esther, Dr. Mervyn Brenneman speaks of Vashti's courage in this action. He says, quote, "Vashti's courage must be acknowledged. She defied her king and her husband by refusing to shame herself in public. Whatever else may be said of her, she was brave. She was willing to give up her status and position as queen in order to do what was right. Her dignity was more important than her place in society. Her act of courage in refusing to present herself before the king is equal by that of Esther, who entered the king's presence without permission." Chapter 5, verse 1. End quote. So in verses 12 through 18, we're told that the king then asked his 7 primary advisors, who were experts in Persian law and justice, what should be done about Queen Vashti and her refusal to obey the king. The Persian kings were very bound to Persian law and precedent, as we have seen in our study of Ezra and Nehemiah. They relied on royal advisors to make decisions and judgments based on Persian law. Memucan, probably the lead advisor, rose and said that the queen had not only wronged the king, but also all the officials and the people living in the provinces. He felt that the women in the provinces and the courts will make their own husbands despicable in their sight. If the queen didn't obey the king, why should I obey you? And this would cause a lot of contempt and anger throughout the kingdom. He was warning about domestic disputes breaking out all over the empire. Quite dramatic, but when you're in that position, you're trying to tell the king what should be done and the consequences. A little bit of hyperbole, but that was the judgment of Memucan. Let's move ahead to verses 19 to 22, the king's edict. In verses 19 to 20, Memucan recommended to the king to issue a royal edict that should be written in the laws of Medo-Persia, so it could not be repealed. Queen Vashti will no longer be able to come into the presence of the king, and that her royal position be given to another more worthy than her. In other words, she will be deposed, removed as queen. As a result, according to Memucan, all the women will give their husbands their proper respect. That is a bit hilarious to me, but that's what they taught her, and that's how they sold it to the king. In verses 21 and 22, the king and the rest of the officials love this idea, of course. What man doesn't crave the respect and honor of their wives or their women? The edict was communicated through all the provinces via letters in all the languages spoken in the empire. And the edict declared that every man was to be in charge in his own house and speak according to anything he wanted to say. Men officially in charge because of the king's edict. Now, these events are all set in motion and governed by God's providence. Without receiving any credit, he sets the stage for the deliverance of his people. Before we go any further, it will be a great time to define what we mean by God's providence. Here's a definition, quote, "Providence is normally defined in Christian theology as the unceasing activity of the Creator, whereby, in overflowing bounty and goodwill, he upholds his creatures in order existence, guides and governs all events, circumstances, and free acts of angels and men, and directs everything to its appointed goal for his own glory." Providence is presented in Scripture as a function of divine sovereignty. God is king over all, doing just what he wills. This conviction, robustly held, pervades the whole Bible. End quote. and that is an entry in the New Bible Dictionary by J.I. Packer. You see, the entire book of Esther is a declaration of God's providence. The circumstances of the banquet, the king's excessive drinking and foolish order, Vashti's defiance, the whole context of how Persian law worked, all these elements working together within God's providence. He is sovereign. Dr. Joyce Baldwin speaks about how the author of the book of Esther contrasts the folly of human government when compared to the rule of Almighty God. She says, quote, "The security and confidence of the author, who could comment in this way on the highest ruler in the contemporary world, as well as on the court and its intrigues, is striking, and witnesses in a totally unconscious way to the efficacy of faith in the living God. This writer knew nothing of an identity crisis, nor was he dismayed by the inadequacies of human government of which he was so aware, because of the overarching government of the one he worshipped but did not name." End quote. So you see, even when God is not mentioned, it is clear in these passages of Scripture that He is ever present, ever in control, His providence overseeing and ruling all things. And that brings us to the end of our first division from Esther chapters 1 and 2. What's our principle? God's providence rules in the affairs of men. God's providence rules in the affairs of men. All the inhabitants of the earth are of no account, but He does according to His will among the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And no one can fend off His hand or say to Him, "What have you done?" Daniel 4:35. How have I seen God's providence in my life work to accomplish His good purposes in my life? How am I preparing myself for what God has for me to do? This concludes part 1 of our teaching from Esther chapters 1 and 2. Thank you for being here today. Next time, we will focus on our second division, A Devoted Queen Rises, chapter 2, verses 1 to 23. Until then, this is Jose Figueroa for An Approved Workman, where we are rightly dividing the word of truth. May God richly bless you.